Hi, I'm Matt Donnelly, and this is another edition of RotoBaller Starts and Sits for week number 10. One of my favorite filmmakers of all time is the great Mel Brooks. His films have been a staple of my life. You'll never see him win an Oscar, but hey, his films, they're usually a result of a comedy of errors that you simply can't help but laugh at. His next film should be titled The Injury Bug, based on the 2024 NFL season for the wide receiver position. It's at that point right now that it's become so bad that you can't help but laugh. Last week, A.J. Brown, knee injury, CeeDee Lamb, AC joint, Drake London, hip, Chris Olave, concussion. They all fell victim to the injury bug. Depth is becoming a real issue, and with Cedric Tillman, Jacoby Myers, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Tyler Lockett all unavailable due to bye weeks, you need some help at the wide receiver. You need some start and sit advice. And you've come to the right place as we break down those wide receiver starts and sits for week number 10. And you know what? Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, he's not going to make this list, but hey, you could do worse than a wide receiver who's got 4 touchdowns in 4 straight games. Now let's talk about those starts and sits. Let's talk about those week 10 fantasy football booms, starting with the return of Nico Collins. Yes, he is coming back this week. Well, he hasn't officially come back, but I'm anticipating his return. And if you forgot just how good he was before his injury, it is time for me to remind you once again. Despite his 4-week absence on the injured reserve list, Collins sits 14th in the National Football League with 567 receiving yards. With 313.4 receiving yards per game, Collins averages 15.5 yards per game, more than Justin Jefferson, who's number 2. From a fantasy lens, that 21.3 fantasy points per game Collins averages this season, that is a full 1.6 fantasy points more than Justin Jefferson. So despite his absence, the Texans pass catcher is still wide receiver 16. With Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs, Collins, he was still seeing a 23.2% target share. Imagine what that number is going to be without Diggs the rest of the way. This week, the Texans face the Detroit Lions team, a team that has allowed 37.87 fantasy points per game over the last month and 41.41 fantasy points against the position throughout the 2024 season. Detroit has limited receivers to just 5 touchdown receptions, but they have allowed the most receptions, 137, and the second most receiving yards, 1,672. For a player who's accounted for a team touchdown market share over 42%, an air yard share of 42.6%, and accounts for 38.4% of the team's receiving yardage, I don't think there will be a way that this Lions defense is going to be able to slow down, let alone contain Collins here this week. My second wide receiver to fire up this week is Darnell Mooney of the Atlanta Falcons as they take on the New Orleans Saints. At least before Drake London exited last week's contest, he managed to catch a touchdown pass for fantasy managers. After he left, it was Darnell Mooney who was catching passes. London is expected to have tests done later this week, but the belief is that it is a hip pointer and he's not expected to be out long term. But if London were to miss some time this week, then all eyes would be on Darnell Mooney, who has exceeded fantasy football expectations all season long. Before Monday Night Football and the conclusion of Week 9, Mooney was sitting as a wide receiver 12, averaging 14.4 fantasy points per game and producing at least 14 fantasy points in 5 of his last 8 contests. Last week, Mooney finished with 19.8 fantasy points, his second week in a row with more than 18 fantasy points. Against the Dallas Cowboys, Mooney finished with 5 catches for 88 yards and a touchdown. He also averaged 17.6 yards per catch. If you look at the league leaders in 20-plus yard receptions, you will find his name at the top of the list. And the third wide receiver I'm starting this week is Deebo Samuel Sr. of the San Francisco 49ers as they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Let's keep piling up those fantasy points with great matchups for the wide receiver position. Deebo Samuel Sr., he gets a great matchup this week against a Buccaneers team that has allowed more than 35 fantasy points per game to the receiver position this season. San Francisco, they've had all week off. They're priming, getting ready for this contest and getting ready for that late season playoff push. If you recall, the last time that we saw Samuel, he just finished hauling in 4 passes for 71 yards and 12.6 fantasy points. But don't let the numbers fool you here. What you probably don't remember is that he had a touchdown and an additional 65 yards that was taken away by a flag, which could easily add another 13 to 14 fantasy points against the Cowboys. Samuel has earned just a 17.9% target share this season, but in week number 8, that number was closer to 27%, a number that I think fantasy managers can expect the rest of the season with Brandon Ayuk on injured reserve. Now let's talk about those week 10 fantasy busts, starting with George Pickens of the Steelers as they take on the Washington Commanders. Like the 49ers, George Pickens and the Pittsburgh Steelers, they are coming off their bye week. However, unlike the 49ers, this matchup is less than favorable for the Steelers wideout. The Commanders went from must start to fade in recent weeks. Over the last 4 weeks, they have allowed just 459 receiving yards to the position. Over that period, they have not allowed a touchdown. Let me repeat that. They have not allowed a touchdown, and they have been the second stingiest unit, allowing just 20.68 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Pickens, to his credit, ranks in the top 10 in 20-plus yard receptions and leads the league with 8 30-plus yard receptions. You are going to need him to hit big this week to get any kind of return on your investment, and that is a risk I'm simply not willing to take. Speaking of risks, how about Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals as they take on the New York Jets? The Cardinals scored 3 touchdowns last week. That's great, except all of them were on the ground. That's bad. Now, you know what, for fantasy, 3 touchdowns, some of them had to go to James Conner and Kyler Murray. No, they didn't. This team cannot be trusted for fantasy production. It is that simple. Against the Bears, Marvin Harrison Jr. was second in the team in receiving yards. Again, that was good. We would assume that this would be a good thing. However, Trey McBride's 35 receiving yards led the way. That's the bad thing. Harrison hauling just a pair of targets for 34 yards, leaving fantasy managers feeling empty inside. This week, the matchup, it doesn't get any better as the New York Jets allow the fewest fantasy points per game, allowing just 24.97 per contest through the last 4 weeks. And my final sit of the week is Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans at the Los Angeles Chargers. Do you want to play the ultimate boom-bust game? It is Calvin Ridley. He's either going to make you look like a genius or a fool. There is no rhyme or reason to where this fantasy production is going to come from. Last week, Ridley, he caught 5 passes there for 73 yards, but he needed overtime to reach double-digit fantasy production. He also dropped a couple passes along the way, which is all part of the Calvin Ridley experience. Now, I get it. Fantasy managers, you can make a case to starting him this week. Since DeAndre Hopkins was traded to the Chiefs, Ridley is averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game. He's also earned a 35% target share, accounted for 46% of the Titans' air yard share, and a 95% route rate. That's the good news. Now for the bad, the Los Angeles Chargers ranked 6th this season in fantasy points allowed to the receiver position, allowing just 26.78 fantasy points per game, thanks in part to surrendering the 4th fewest receiving yards at 1,014. Adding insult to a bad matchup, Ridley has a drop rate of 10.2% and is tied for 5th in drops this season. Well, looking at the percentage of his targets he has had an opportunity to catch, his 61.2% does not lend itself to sustainable fantasy production, and neither does Mason Rudolph. But you know who does lead to sustainable fantasy production? RotoBaller.com. Go there for all the latest news and analysis, and head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll find me there answering questions 24/7. See you next time.